Alright, let's talk about posing real quick. Mostly so that I set you up with expectations. Okay, so we're going to talk about posing now. We're going to probably spend like about 10 minutes on that. And then what we're going to do is really start to, well, we'll get into more of the hard surface stuff basically. We're going to start setting up with mesh extraction, things like that. And but what I want to do right now is just give you a sense of expectation in terms of this posing and what are some guidelines for you doing this. So one thing to keep in mind is this is probably not enough resolution. You know, there's going to be some problems in deformation, maybe, and maybe not. Depends on what you need to do, in all essence. So let's turn symmetry off. I'm going to say start to pose this. I'm going to make sure there's no alpha. And let's talk about mechanics here real quick. I'm going to work with the traditional conception. We've got, let's separate them in green. So we have the rib, we have the hip, we have the head, we're going to have the arm, the leg, then we're going to have the upper arm, lower arm, we're going to have the upper leg, lower leg, the foot, and the hand. Okay, and of course in between all of this you have the spine, but we don't really focus on that too terribly much. First thing I'm going to do is put this thing in Contrapposto, and the one thing you need to know about Contrapposto is that it is not a simple rotation of the hip, rib, and head. They don't just simply rotate and then balance on top of each other. That's not the way this happens. So the first thing that happens is that the hip rotates. In fact, let's do that as a box. When the hip rotates, it takes the spine and starts to shoot it off here. And then the spine and the rib starts to correct. So next thing you know, the rib cage has shifted over, and then the head has to manage, and so that arm's there, and then that's there, and then this is doing its thing, and now suddenly you understand that fashion pose a little bit better. But this was really important for me to communicate with you guys, because when people are posing in Contrapposto, they often forget that that whole rib cage needs to shift over. So what that means is that in my initial thing, the first thing that I want to do is not just come in here and say, well, let me just rotate the hip. Rotate, center dot, and rotate, and then do that. That's not Contrapposto. That's a broken spine. So what you need to do instead is, how do I say it? You need to rotate the whole model. So you rotate the whole model, that sets up the pelvis, it'll set you up perfectly for the rib cage, and then you're good from there. Now the leg, we'll find out where's the femur, and this is all anatomy. If you don't know this, it's fine. It's not part of the course, it's just if you're posing it helps. I'm going to rotate that, and you can start to see he's losing his butt. So you may want to come in to draw and press Control to just really mask out some parts, because the butt is kind of locked in there. This is the ilium, that's the hip. I mean, there's nothing moving up there. It should only move from the great trochanter down. So you might have to adjust this. And it's important to mention that because a lot of people think of this as a de facto solution, a rig, so to speak. And we did talk about creating an actual rig in development, because it is possible. For example, you could just go through here and like draw bones. And then those bones quote unquote activate. And then you have a rig, you know, that works from there. It's totally possible, but it complicates this entire mechanism, and it means that transpose, which we use for posing, and everything just becomes weird. This becomes a bone as opposed to a staff of power. So the expectation here is it's going to get you mostly there, but if you're dealing with a character, you might have to adjust things. And that's par for the course. And also sometimes you got to watch where you're putting that rotation. So there, that's a little better. Okay, same thing here. Boom. Boom. Da-do. Move it a little bit more towards the center. Okay, and now we can come into the rib cage. And where do you move the rib cage? You can get all kinds of detailed about this, like do you move it at the 10th rib, which comes down around here? Do you move? They say that the artists say that the ribs do not move. It's not accurate. They do flex. My wife is pregnant right now, and her ribs are actually rotating. Which, when I heard that, I had to know more. And that's basically these ribs, the baby's in there pushing everything out, and the ribs are moving away from their cartilage enough to where they actually rotate. And if ribs, fixed on one side, coming around to the other side, and I was instantly thinking, okay, well, that thing's rotating up and down. Holy crap. That can't be good. But it's a little bit different than that. They're just rotating minuscule amounts, little tiny bits, and the intercostal muscles are supporting them a little bit, but they get all tweaked. So that's all to say, the artists for simplicity will say that it does not rotate, it does not bend, they're fused, but if my wife's ribs are rotating, I can guarantee you there's a little bit of flex in there. But for the sake of argument, keep it at what you want, and what I do is I use the 10th. Sometimes I'll come up here, but 10th really works for me, where the 10th rib is, or somewhere above the belly button. Okay, and notice he's not looking sexy. This is not. He's looking. I'm a little scared. The rig is temporary. Don't try to make it perfect. It's only temporary. Now, let's put a little bit of rotation. So I'm going to give him a little bit of boom. Control click to invert. Boom. I'm going to make him really arch his back into some relaxation. Get him super modeled up. I might even leave that because I really just don't care. And if I really want to fix that, how quick is it to just come in here and use the move brush? If this is a problem, then you need to consider that transpose isn't the solution, because you need something more robust, and that's fine. Transpose was not trying to replace rigs. That was a conscious decision. It is not trying to replace rigs, but it is trying to give people who don't have access to rigs another solution. Okay, I got to show you a couple more things. It's taken longer than 10 minutes. I need to show you how do you pronate a forearm, and then also how do you lift an arm. And the reason why is to set expectations and just some good practices for posing. So let's work with transpose or pronation first. And pronation is if you take your hand out, you got your palm facing up, and then you move your palm to down. That's just pronation. Some people will also move this along and say basically make it a humerus. I do that as well, sometimes, but not always. But there's some benefits to it. Okay, so let me explain this real quick then. We're going to pronate. So by pronating we mean we're going to take this hand and we're going to flip it around. Okay, and when we're flipping it around, we need to choose somewhere here the place in which you're gonna have the mask end. So we're gonna mask out, and then we have our bone from one point to another. So it's the bone with its endpoints, and it's the mask with its endpoints. And the easiest thing, because it fits the anatomy, is you just try to make that mask half. So control click, then you draw out your bone. You got to place that in the center, so you got to go to the side view, and then you got to move that center dot. It is not a guarantee that you're going to get that all at once, so don't be afraid to adjust that. Oops, I lost it. It's one of the problems. So I'm going to come and say mask out a little lower, and then I got to redraw the bone. And I'm going to come out and do that again. So something a little bit more like that. Okay, so we've got that kind of done. The important elements of that are, it's not going to be perfect the first time, and you may still have to go in and adjust the sculpt, and that's 100% understandable. When you see what we do when we raise the arm up, you'll be very surprised. Now, thankfully, the arm muscle, the arm's anatomy actually really helps you figure this stuff out, because that extensor, carpi radialis longus, and brevis, and radialis group just really help with this polyflow, because that's basically your radialis group right there. And then these are your extensors. But you got to take the anatomy class for that one. That's a process. Alright. So the key thing is just to help you understand what to expect. I can show you also fingers, and I'm only going to show them briefly because the most important thing for you to understand about fingers is that they're painful. And I'm saying that jokingly, but also intentionally, because people want these to be easier, and they are not. Okay, they will be hard. The only thing I will say is that the blur that is default, see how much of that blurs, is too much. You come in here to mask blur strength, and you can lower that. So this is in preference, transpose, mask blur strength, and hopefully it's less. Let's see if I'm wrong. Yeah. When you're working on fingers, you basically have to kind of use this very angular approach. And sometimes you have to use the move brush, and sometimes you just have, there's a lot of work basically, in a nutshell, to get these fingers working. But mask blur strength is what I would use. Okay, last thing we got to look at for posing is how am I going to raise this hand, this arm? What are my expectations? Can I keep the sculpt I have there? The short answer on that is that this is going to get ugly really quick. But let's understand, I mean, in fact, see, we're getting that anatomy. We're not getting the clean edge loops. Okay, but let's talk anatomy. Clavicle goes up, humerus raises, tips up. So this whole region, and this trapezius compresses, this whole region moves upwards in space. So we need to reflect that in how we adjust this, but first we need that edge loop to work. Alright. You could start with something right there at the clavicle. You could start there, as long as you're willing to do these things, to kind of test this out. Let me really lower that blur strength. I'm going to just see something's moving. Okay, there we go. Better. Control click to blur it. Okay. I got it halfway there, but I have a bit of a curve here. Yeah, I'm not going to sweat that. The most important thing was moving this bulk up. You don't even need to use rotate. A lot of people think, okay, I got to rotate this. Why? Just move it. Just adjust it. Not a big deal. It's going to look like crap. If you understand that it's going to look like crap in the beginning, then you'll be fine. You might have heard me say this before, but Buddhism, which I'm not, but Buddhism teaches us that all frustration is either the root of having something you don't want or wanting something you don't have, which boils down to your expectations are too much. I say that to my wife every now and then, and that does not go over well. Alright, now I've got to rotate, and we got to turn symmetry off, and I need that to behave. Yes, okay. Is it right to go crazy like this? I mean, that's ugly, but it's fast. But it's ugly. But it's fast. But that's really ugly. Well, watch how quickly that gets fixed. As long as you've got this in the right position. Say, yeah, okay. And first, all we're doing is we're lifting. Okay. Normally I wouldn't have allowed it to adjust the other side like that. But this is, at the end of the day, not horrible. You got to make sure you're masking things off. I'm going to go into my lasso. So I would have been a little bit more careful, but just smoothing this out and adjusting this in this sense right now, like I am. Really does the trick. So if you need to raise, just get up there, raise it, and then you can adjust from there. Now once I'm up here, I got to start talking and considering what kind of rotation is happening in here. Is he rotating his elbow, stuff like that. And again, you can go extreme like I just did. And we can start to go extreme. And if you don't have a lot of sculpted geometry, this is not a horrible solution because you just smooth it and inflate it back out. And then you can adjust your topology, your lines a little bit for flow. And then you do your measurement. Did I screw this up? Let's see. I mean, I definitely screwed this up with his face, but let's check at one head measurement. I'm going to go over here to transpose units. I'm going to set my calibration distance to 1 because I'm looking for a head unit now. And now that I know that, and I know that the humerus is 1.5, a little bit under 1.5, I can just say, well, clavicle came up, head of the humerus, okay, and then the elbow and the olecranon process, and then the radius is getting all of that. So I need to measure somewhere in here to just below the elbow. Ba-boom, 1.59. Yeah. Pretty crazy, but it's not, it's done. And yeah, I just smoothed it out and then inflated. You know, so I got a lot more work to do here, but that's a that's a whole posing thing. Now, one other element that I'll bring up, when you're coming up with poses, a lot of people forget that there are maquettes in here. Let me see if I can find the ZTL. Oh, this is a new version. I haven't saved one out yet. Okay. In Project and in Mannequin, you should see my 8-head male and female, and then you'll see the one created by Pixelator. I use these. I use these mannequins to pose it out in advance to help me map out what I'm going to do with Transpose. Because, yeah, it gets a bit complicated. You know, I mean, this guy's, he's sexy. It's hard to, sculpt him wrong, because look at that. The power. But mannequins give me a lot more choices. And if you're wondering about Z-sphere rigs, they are powerful. I don't use them very much, and the reason why I don't use them very much is because they don't pronate, and they don't rotate the forearms, and there's a lot of setup, and I just like to get in with Z-spheres. So, all right, we're gonna move on. Any questions? So to answer that question, Steve, I use this because it's really super fast. All right, give me a shout out. Questions, yes, no. You guys doing okay? While you're answering, I'm going to just cover what we did already. So, subtool primer, transpose primer. We did a measurement primer, including ZBrush's real world and all that. Transpose posing. That's where we just ended. And now we need to talk about surface. It's really a hard surface primer. We're not going to get into the panels loop stuff until next week, I think. We really, in order for panel loops, number one, it's so simple. Really, really simple. But it's really powerful if you know how to combine it with more features. So I want to make sure panel loops is in context. Looking at the questions again. So if you're showing off a character with multiple poses, I guess you'd clone them and repose. Yes, I absolutely do that. Okay. Oh, I just saw this a couple seconds ago about sculpting based on the eventual pose. Okay, good. Thank you, Johannes, for bringing that up. All right, so in just a moment, we're going to get into hard surface primer, and we're going to start talking about all of those features. Again, on the basic level. We'll get really exciting next week and the week after. But the question is now, excuse me. My keyboard keeps locking here. So the question now is, if you're going to sculpt the character, to pose or not to pose. Because maybe you sculpt it in pose. And there's a real big key for this. So do I sculpt and then pose, or do I pose and then sculpt? To be honest, you do both. Okay, there is no one or the other. You do both, but there are variables. So the first thing you need to know, the first rule, is that posing inside of ZBrush will cause you to lose sculpt. You will lose sculpt. Anytime you have to pose, there will be some degradation and you will have to re-sculpt. Now that's not uncommon. For example, if you're working in clay and you want to change the pose, well, you might take your model, let's say some kind of dangling pose with an arm up there and his head hanging back like this, and you might say you need to pose that leg so that you get this guy up, and then you want to move him down there. Well, you've got to grab this green piece and move it back to where the red line is. So you might have to resculpt some things. You might need to harden this arm, or harden that knee. Not a lot of resculpting. It's very minor. But now let's say if you want to rotate him around so that he's now facing us, and this arm that used to be up is now pointing down, and you can see his head a little bit more, and then this arm is up in this direction. Well, now you have to cut where these white lines are. You're going to have to cut the arms. You're going to probably have to cut the neck a little bit, and you got to get your hands on him, and you got to move him into place, and you got to take this arm and move this arm all the way down. You're going to have a lot of resculpting, especially where these cut marks are, and then you're going to have to sculpt the compression in there again. Any posing is going to require some resculpting. Even if you rig this in Maya with a gorgeous rig, the further you stretch the repose, the more you're going to have corrective blend shapes or something of that nature. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't rigged in a long time, but they still use things like corrective blend shapes to adjust the shape. Somebody give me a shout out and let me know if I walked into the wrong century. But the key thing is that posing equals adjustment. Some sort of thing you have to change. So if you're working with toys and the model is only ever in that position, then you start with the pose. But here's the little added thing. You might have a base mesh or some previous sculpt that has a lot of sculpt. You might have a complete default character with all this crazy anatomy, and then you delete his subdivision levels, you pose him, and then you start all over again. Okay, that'll happen. If you're in games, you're not doing a lot of posing. That's rigged, right? So you start with a T pose or a neutral pose, not T pose. Neutral pose, and then your job there in your demo reel is that you're just going to show people what you can do. So you also need to show them that you can rig, so to speak. If you don't want to do that though, you are going to need to show them the neutral pose. So you just need to assume that you're going to show the neutral pose, you're going to pose it, and then you're just going to sculpt fixed. Like if you've seen demo reels for some people where the character is in some kind of action, causing some danger, or if you see Simon Lee's stuff, I took a class with Simon Lee, actually. It was a lot of fun to get on the other end of it. And it's real simple the way he does it. He puts the clay on it in a neutral pose, gets it to a certain stage, poses it, and then continues the sculpt from there. So I hope, Johannes, that answered your question. Okay. So let's leave our sexy guy. What's the Steve Martin line? And we're going to move into hard surface. So we're going to go into Lightbox, go into Projects, Default Sphere, and we'll use this, but I'm going to increase the color. And why don't we increase the background color? There. Make it a little easier for you guys to see it. Daniel, we're not going to do Boolean for subtools right now. It's more of when we get into the remeshing and combining of them and stuff like that. So that's part we want to cover that in terms of covering topology options, so to speak. Although it is part of a hard surface thing that we could do.